In 2020, mass anti-government protests erupted across Belarus. The brutal crackdown that followed shocked the international community. The authorities arrested tens of thousands of citizens, shut down independent media and NGOs, and fomented a migration crisis on the border of the European Union. But where many thought Belarus's dictator, Alyaksandr Lukashenko, would fall, he instead turned to Moscow for support and intensified the repression. Many of his opponents fled the country. Then, in February 2022, Belarus provided a staging area for Russia's invasion of Ukraine, allowing troops and weapons to be based on its territory as large-scale war returned to Eastern Europe once again. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please, if you like this material, like and share it around your community and network. Please also do check out the validated Ukrainian charities that appear in the description of the video. As I say every time, it's incredibly important to help Ukraine remain resilient. Katsiaryna Shmatsina is a Belarusian political analyst focusing on foreign policy, regional security, and the impact of great power relations on smaller actors. Katsiaryna's portfolio includes a non-residential fellow at the German Marshall Fund in 2020 and Think Visegrad Fellowship in 2019. Previously, she worked for the American Bar Association, where she managed democratic governance and rule of law projects. She holds a master's degree in international relations from Syracuse University, New York, and a law degree from the Belarusian State University. She is also a vocal dissident who's been sanctioned by both the Belarusian and Russian governments. I'm delighted to welcome you to Silicon Curtain.
Hi, great to be here. That's quite an introduction.
There's a lot to unpack. Well, I know the audience is going to be especially curious as to why you are sanctioned by both governments. And actually, it's rather more serious than that, isn't it? You can't possibly step foot in either country while these warrants are out. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
So I've been receiving, so right now I am sentenced to 10 years in Belarus. That was a trial in absentia. The trial was ongoing this summer. And there were 20 other scholars and some politicians on this list. And we were somehow like all together pulled in the same criminal case, accused of trying to overthrow the legitimate government in Belarus. And I think, and some of us didn't even know each other before the trial began in absentia. And I can talk about the procedure of the trial, like if that's of interest. And
It
then,
definitely is. I mean, that was going to be one of my questions as well, which was the similarities to the kind of puppet theater or show trials of the Stalinist eras, because I've watched some of those procedures in Russia, and they are absurd. Doesn't even cover it. So I'd like to hear about your experience, definitely.
yeah, so I'll jump into this in a second, and then in February, I think this year, I found out that I'm on the federal wanted list in Russia. I don't know why, because not everyone from my criminal case are included. Some are. Um, and yeah, like in a way, it's flattering because that's a good list of people on the federal wanted list. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of other Belarusians, also Prime Minister of Estonia, and some US senators. So I would say that's rather flattering.
That's good company you're keeping there, definitely. I know a lot of us who are doing these channels often feel we're not doing enough if we haven't been sanctioned because we haven't got onto the radar yet. But I mean, joking aside, it is serious. Are there any implications, any financial implications, or any implications for your work and research in having such a judgment hanging over you?
Well, I had to flee Belarus 4 years ago, a couple of days right after the elections. I had a sense that I was watched, and I saw some of my colleagues being targeted. And I mean, colleagues, not only political analysts, but people I worked with, such as journalists who were beaten, arrested, threatened. And I knew that like I could be next. And let's say, given my previous track record of maybe consulting some political opposition groups. I knew that I've been on the radar for quite a few years. And so I fled, and there were interesting, again, like circumstances where I called an Uber and then the driver didn't act like an Uber driver. He looked like more like a KGB type of guy who was interrogating almost me like on the way to the train station where I was heading. Like, why am I leaving the city at this time? How many people gonna wait for me in the place of my destination when I'm coming back? And then, like, in one hand, it could sound like a paranoia, like, are you like exaggerating? But then I would talk to human rights defenders who would say, like, oh yeah, like we know that KGB has access to the taxi services, and it's not uncommon that they would track someone down that way. Or if a driver does not necessarily like work for KGB, but they could be like a little bit like on a part-time like payroll type of work for them. And long story short, like I was safe, like I left safely. And that was during the time when it was still safe to leave, or it seemed that for the government at that time, the idea was, okay, let those outliers, like inconvenient voices, just leave the country, rather than create trouble at home. But then a couple of weeks later, there were like journalists or experts who were detained either at the attempt of leave the country or right upon their arrival. And some of my colleagues are behind the bars, like sentenced for like 6, 10 years. And I'm not mentioning their names because right now, like the trend is, like a fortune trend is that it does not help to mention particular names of certain political prisoners. It does not improve their conditions. It was not the case a couple of years ago. It was the other way around. Like the more you create noise at any like panel discussion or in the media, it would prevent them from being, I don't know, mistreated in jail. Right now, it's not the case. I always like when I talk about this experience, I don't want to sound like too dramatic, but at the same time, like these are the facts.
Yeah, I mean it's not surprising actually, and even reporters, BBC and others who were still operating in Russia, even prior to COVID, would often be tailed and followed. I think that's not paranoid at all. If they're definitely out to get you, it's not paranoia. And those opposition leaders who did remain in the country, I mean, it's rumored, of course, that really terrible things are happening to them, things like torture and starvation in prison. So again, the regime seems to show that it's prepared to do anything, but also that it no longer really cares about international opinion, and projecting any kind of decent image in the international community. Is that a fair statement?
In a way, look at Lukashenko as a like like a opportunistic politician. Right now, when he's clinging to power, and as you mentioned, when like his survival right now depends on Russia, he doesn't seem to care, and he's isolated. And then like he saw that the threat to his rule was very imminent in 2020, and then he resorted to repressions at any cost. But I would also remind, like, I'm not surprised by the current conditions of political prisoners or the scale of repressions, is has been in power for 30 years now, exactly 30 years. And in the 90s, there were his opponents disappeared, and later appeared the evidence of physical destruction, like people were abducted and then killed. Or there were other instances where opponents were put in jail, and some of them, like I was recently thinking about this person, like I don't want to mention their name because relatives still live in the country, but the person who was posing a threat, or whom he worked with Lukashenko in the early days of Lukashenko in power in the 90s. And then when he fell out of favor, the person got out of jail, and was released when he was no longer a threat in terms of like his health conditions and the person like passed away like shortly after being released. And that definitely is like reminds the current conditions. Let's say, even if we look at what happened to Navalny, or right now, if we speak about Belarusian prisoners, there is a lot of concern about the health of Maria Kolesnikova, who's been incommunicado for over a year. And like the only thing we know is some rumors we get from former political prisoners, like women in the same jail, who might hear something about her conditions, and we know that it's like dire conditions. So it looks like Lukashenko now tries to get rid of his opponents essentially like at any cost without directly like assassinating them.
And that, of course, very much reflects, as you say, what happened in Russia with Navalny. And even though everyone kind of knows what's happened, there is an element there of plausible deniability as well. Now, you talked about the crackdown on NGOs. And I think you've listed things like NGOs, think tanks, university researchers, in fact, any independent voices. At what point was the real crackdown on these begun? Or is it the case that they've always been under suspicion and monitored, but at some point their activities were seen as no longer acceptable within Belarus?
It's hard really for me to imagine that at some point, well, I mean, I'm 33 years old. Lukashenko has been in power for 30. So it's really like I cannot imagine or like even if I look at the like history books or like facts, it's like, really hard to imagine the time when there was um freedom of press or the NGOs could operate freely. There was a short period of time in the, let's say, early 90s, maybe like 95, 96, that's when it came to an end. Because that's when I look, let's say, like American Bar Association, the organization where I used to work, they used to have an office, like rule of law programs working for Belarus. Then they were considered as a sort of foreign agent, like evil influence, they were kicked out. Again, that was happening like in the 90s. I would also bring up the moment when Lukashenko, again, like I think it was 95, when he ordered, like he started slowly but steadily consolidating powers. And one of the first manifestations of it was when he ordered the police to beat the members of parliament who were opposing him, and like drag them out of the premises. Later, there would appear like interviews of former Minister of Interior who was later abducted, Yuri Zakharenko. He was saying like, well, I was ordered to essentially disregard the rule of law or all the existing laws and just serve as a like extension of power or like to serve the interests of Lukashenko directly. I refused. And then him and the head of electoral commission were replaced. And that, of course, had implications or similar rules applied to the uh, everyday life of the civil society. And so when I was living, working in Belarus, we would always have this sense of being surveyed, like closely watched. It was not uncommon when, let's say, when I was a research fellow at Belarusian Institute for Strategic Studies, and sometimes we would meet with, let's say, diplomats, like European diplomats, and we would meet in a cafe, just sort of meet and greet type of conversation. And at the table next to us, we would see someone very attentive, like some very attentively looking man reading a newspaper and like staring at us. And again, that was not uncommon. And like Belarusian Institute for Strategic Studies, as well as other research institutions, think tanks, or many of us, we would prefer to register abroad in European Union without risking to register and operate like as a legal entity in Belarus. Why? Because there were like the government would create like a pretext of like it could get into jail as a, let's say, director of this institution for not paying taxes correctly, which would be just a fabricated sort of case where in fact you're prosecuted for working as an independent think tanker. That was not common, and usually depended on like, are you in the liberal, is Belarusian government in the state of normalization of relations with the EU, in the liberalization phase, so to say, or we're again, once again, sanctions by the West and trying to be buddies with Moscow instead. And then it was almost intuitive feeling, I guess, for me and my colleagues to know that somewhere between, let's say, 2014 and 19, when Lukashenko was like trying to pretend that he is like a donor of regional stability, the way he was presenting himself to the West, following the annexation of Crimea and him not recognizing it, the annexation, etc. So he definitely capitalized on that situation. And for us and the civil society, it was like a time where we felt more free. And then the presidential elections 2015, they were super peaceful. Like, there were no protests. It doesn't mean that people were content with the status quo, but there was no substantial protest. So it meant that my colleagues and I, we didn't have to be super cautious in what we say in the public discussion, or we didn't have to, let's say, leave the country for the period of elections, electoral campaign, just to be on the safe side. I know that certain opposition activists are the most visible political figures during every elections, be it even local or parliamentary elections, which again, no one is even counting the votes there. Like, it's ridiculous. And even if they did, the local administrations don't decide much. But those elections were used by the government as a like as a time to first like identify and target the opponents, and at the same time to maybe like to have little training for the upcoming presidential elections. And what I mean by it is that preemptive arrests were not uncommon, and certain opposition figures who knew that they were like were closely watched, they would leave their homes and they would try to stay somewhere else. They would shut down, like not use their mobile phones, or maybe go spend this couple of weeks in the countryside. And that was like a routine measure for those activists to stay safe. And there was a time, for instance, when I was monitoring or helping to process the results of like voting results from the polling station. And then my colleagues and I, like, we would choose to travel to one of European capitals to do that, because we didn't know, are we going to be targeted or not? And it's not necessarily like, if you look at the headlines, maybe it does not really hit the headlines, but you know that, like, if you speak to people, you know, or like not everyone would share that, like, oh, someone knocked in my, like, I was dragged up my apartment when I was processing that, when I was in, like, I know that some, again, opposition activists were like targeted by the police when they were trying to process those results of like from the polling stations. And another maybe observation with the work of the opposition parties, again, like what you could see, like if you just Google what their programs are about, or what were the names, you would just know that government did not register any new opposition, like any new alternative democratic, pro-democratic parties for quite a few years. Like the only ones, or the major, the old school opposition parties were registered in the 90s. And then the new ones, let's say Tell the Truth, Говори Правду, or Movement for Freedom, За Свободу, they were denied registration, not only as a political party, but also as a NGO at all. And in case of for freedom movement, there was quite a lot of like pressure from Brussels, like some informal talks with like Belarusian regime to convince to give them some sort of registration, and then they were registered finally as a educational nonprofit. So that again tells something like about the climate. And maybe one final point is, of course, the like infiltration or the pressure on the opposition groups on behalf of KGB. Not uncommon to know that like some of your peers would be leaking information like on the major activities. And I also know people who were approached by KGB folks the moment when this particular person was promoted within the opposition group, like when they got more responsibilities. And then they discovered like, oh, wow, like the KGB officer who approached me, they know quite a lot about my personal life, like academic life, because that was, again, not uncommon when a student would, an activist would walk into the dean's office, and instead of the dean, they would see some shady guy wearing a gray suit, sharing like overwhelming him or her with details of their private life, and forcing to cooperate. So these were the realities even before 2020. I guess that's my main point. Like, so whatever we are seeing now, it's not so much of a surprise.
It is truly disturbing, of course, that it's Orwellian that you cannot have any details of your private life or activity that escapes their notice. I want to talk about sort of Maidan in a minute and civic society, but let's draw some parallels at this point between Belarus and Georgia, because here you have that similar, almost sort of phony debate, creating this uncertainty. Might we even join the EU? Might we not? When we know that there's no possibility whatsoever of removing Belarus from Russia's orbit, so long as the Kremlin is able to exert, power, control, and leverage as it currently does. And there's a similar process in Georgia, where this debate's been going on for a number of years. Whereas as the regime in Georgia begins to trot out ever more Moscow-friendly kind of lines, it shows that all of that stuff, all of those trappings of democracy and pluralism, most likely has been just a front, just a facade, an illusion all of these years. Now, the state capture of Georgia is not complete yet. The state capture of Belarus seems to be complete in that it has no independence of movement to do anything that Moscow doesn't approve of. What parallels do you see between Georgia and the Georgian dream and what happened in Belarus?
Well, I'm thinking about the pro-European moods, or in general, the public opinion polls in terms of geopolitical orientations in Belarus. And on the surface, it could look like we're existing in the Russian media space, or indoctrinated by the Belarusian ideology that we are not a European nation, in fact. And that's something that I was noticed, like, it really hurts, like, to observe, to see that you're separated by, like, the wall, almost like the Berlin Wall, or the Iron Curtain, from the West, when the distance to travel to Lithuania or to Vilnius from Minsk is like, I don't know, 2 hour drive, but you have to take, you have to get a visa, and if you're like lucky to get one, and then cross the border. Most recently, by the way, like the new normal for Belarusians is to their phone, like their phones are being checked at the, or like screened at the border. They're asked to unlock their phones, and if you're subscribed to some Western media channels, you could get in trouble, or they would look through, the border guard could look through your private correspondence. In some cases, there are KGB guys interviewing you. And even prior to 2020, like in terms of academic, I could judge from my experience of being in law school in Belarusian State University, which is sort of like number one. Like it was good enough education, but it's state university. And again, you would see quite a lot of ideological control, especially if you're in law school or international relations, because the government is like watching the students as a troublesome group. And I recall that it was much easier to go to a conference to Moscow or anywhere like Russia. Until Maidan, it was easy to go to Ukraine as well. But then it became an undesirable destination. And then if you want to go to Vilnius, it would raise suspicions, like why are you like why do you want to go to this conference? And sort of same things apply to even like academic topics, like for research. It's not uncommon to have self-censorship in terms of, let's say, not touching some sensitive subjects of writing about the wars that Belarus and Russia were fighting, like Belarus and Russian Empire. Not to talk maybe too much about the Belarus being part of European family as part of, let's say, Grand Duchy of Lithuania. And it applies like by this day in terms of Lukashenko ideology. And when it comes to pro-European moods, the interesting part that like my takeaway when I look at the public opinion polls and the pollsters that I trust, and of course those pollsters operate from abroad, and it's not easy to measure public opinion, but they tend to say that the public moods depend very much on the like current, in a way, maybe like even the news cycle, or like when we're isolated, we tend to, when Belarusians are isolated, they tend to think that Europe is out of reach, and this is just a place where you could go like travel on your little short-term visa and then come back, while there is no border and freedom of movement and labor movement with Russia, so it's relatively easier. And then you would feel like, oh, maybe I'm more accepted in Russia. And then all the TV channels you can, like the overwhelming amount of TV channels you can get, or news, other media sources, like it's all in Russian and coming from Russia. So that way you just become integrated in this Eurasian space. But what the pollsters do acknowledge, they say like this changes like quite quickly, and at the time of repressions, or when the Russians, at the same time, like Belarusians have a strong sense of national identity, they don't consider themselves Russians. It just in terms of they feel that there are more opportunities or less barriers towards traveling, working, moving to Russia, or I don't know, Kazakhstan, whatever the creature of the Eurasian Economic Union is. But it's artificial, I would say, division, and the pro-European moods are out there. I would say that if you look at the charters, the major documents of the opposition groups, they all have the aspiration for European future, European vector for Belarus. Now, how feasible it is, like right now, it looks unrealistic to say the least. But in many protests, like major protests, let's say 2006, 2010, there were European flags on the in the streets. And then the point of 2020, from what I gather, among the, like, you would not necessarily see many flags of any political sort of orientations. It was more I think the not even like the leaders of the protest, because it was leaderless, but still the groups that were taking part in the protests, be it like women's marches or students' marches, the point was to keep the protest, not to accentuate the geopolitical orientations, but to just protest the policies of Lukashenko and to advocate for him stepping out of power.
And it's an interesting comparison, isn't it, with Ukraine, because Ukraine has been on this journey where I think even from the point of independence, a lot of people already felt to an extent that there were opportunities to go to Europe. And for quite a considerable period, there weren't the sort of same barriers. People could study, work, etc. There were those opportunities. But gradually, it's been a sort of fight for Ukraine's soul. And I won't say, it's external people trying to shake them. This is an internal struggle in Ukraine as to whether its future lies east or west. And I think most Ukrainians, even prior to the full-scale war, had pretty much come to the conclusion that the future was to look more towards the West, not necessarily to reject everything about the East. This is, of course, prior to 2014, but Russia, through its sort of aggression, has sort of forced that and forced that process to accelerate even further. But also, you mentioned the Duchy of Lithuania. There are big chunks of Ukraine which still have that connection to mainstream European history, identity, politics, and the huge movements of European history, from the Reformation to many other things as well. And you have the Ukrainian language, which is a kind of barrier to the full, blast of the Russian information sphere. Is Belarus, in that sense, in a slightly weaker position, both because linguistically, but it's still further away from, that current of European history and events? Or do people not see it that way?
I still, like myself, when I think about it, I try to understand what exactly went wrong with us. When we talk about the role of Belarusian language, so there's no, it's a government policy. First, again, it was conducted by the Soviets and then by the Lukashenko regime, has been very hostile to Belarusian language. He sees this as a threat to himself personally. And it goes back to the times when he was in the late 80s, early 90s, when the so-called nationalists, and meaning essentially the political activists and then political parties who were standing on the position that Belarusian language should be the only official language in the country. They were criticizing Lukashenko, and they could see that he's not quite a decent candidate, let's put it that way. But he made it to power through democratic elections because he seemed to be in the eyes of the broader population, he was charismatic, now we would say populist. And he looked like a young, energetic leader. And I also know a bunch of educated people who served as consultants in his campaign. They're now in the opposition, and some went through repressions right now. But then they saw him as a Polish, as a someone like Lech Walesa in Poland, who is a guy from the village who is very passionate to create a change, fighting for a just cause. It turns out it was not quite yet that. But in the early days, those so-called nationalists, those who spoke Belarusian language, and who were creating the opposition to him in the parliament, they were Lukashenko feels personal disgust, and he feels insecure when he thinks about those who oppose him, and he doesn't speak Belarusian well, by the way. He could sometimes just read it from paper with not very good pronunciation. And it has been, and I think also the his idea was to play on the Russian grievances of losing oh so many countries in the neighborhood, and here it was, Belarus sort of claiming, Belarusian government claiming that we are brothers, hence we're developing the Union State integration project with Russia. The integration project signed in 99, I think. And that was part of the government policy to reduce the usage of Belarusian language, which very much reminds me, let's say, the Russian Empire administrations, be it in Vilnius or like on Belarusian territories, etc., or the Soviets, how they would conduct the Belarusian grammar reforms, simplifying Belarusian language and making it sound and look closer to Russian. And this is the realities we continue living in. Just for example, you cannot, like the number of Belarusian schools is constantly decreasing. There is no higher education institution where you could receive education in Belarusian language. How about that? There are some professors who, like out of their own enthusiasm, could teach in Belarusian language, but you cannot receive education fully in Belarusian if you would like to. I was one of those weirdos in law school. I didn't last long, by the way. Like I was trying to speak Belarusian and write my essays in Belarusian. Maybe I think I lasted maybe for a year, maybe even less. When everyone is staring at you and like not everyone approves what you're doing. Like we're speaking your own like mother tongue. Like sometimes it just gets hard, especially. Oh, and I remember like there are no like laws are typically not published in Belarusian, and the codes especially like not published in Belarusian. When we would ask some government officials, let's say like folks from the Supreme Court or from the parliament, like why is this the case, they literally would respond something along the lines like why waste paper in it. So that's and that being said, the Belarusian language does exist in the underground. And it is the language, by the way, of the Catholic Church in Belarus, which I would say acts as a actor of civil society, I would dare to say so, compared to the Russian Orthodox Church, which overwhelmingly uses Russian language. It almost feels like the services, the sermons in Belarusian language in the Orthodox Church sometimes are scheduled like in the most inconvenient time, like I don't know, 6 a.m. on Sunday, so that no one would want to attend it. And independent publishing, first, like why would the government allow anyone to publish what they want, right? Like that's dangerous, like on their own. And then if you want to publish in Belarusian, like most often it would happen like the publishers would publish their books in like abroad and then maybe like smuggle it to Belarus and then sell it somewhere like at the book fair. So Belarusian language does exist, but in a quite restricted environment. And then I would say lastly, if during the times of like normalization, it was okay-ish to use Belarusian language, let's say if I would want to go to tax office to submit my declaration, like tax declaration, it would be okay-ish. Sometimes it could even look cute. Like sometimes were good reactions on behalf of those officials. But right now it is so strongly associated with the opposition to the government. I would definitely not recommend talking to a, let's say, police officer on the street in Belarusian, because that immediately indicates that, oh, you're the next target, like you're one of those inconvenient voices.
It's extraordinary, isn't it, that it can be subversive to speak your native language and actually the original language of your country. It's an extraordinary idea. In Ukraine, of course, Russian and Ukrainian was used almost interchangeably in many places and didn't have a stigma attached to it. Now, of course, with Russia's aggression, there is a certain stigma, and certain people, even if they understand and can speak Russian, will not do so because it might be painful for them, or in some cases, it's a political statement or gesture. And of course, in Ukraine, we had Maidan. It wasn't just one revolution; it was multiple revolutions, and almost kind of national character of, I'd almost say, sort of stubbornness and refusing to accept what power tells you to. Observing the reaction to the election and the huge mobilization of civic society, which almost seemed on the cusp of winning, actually, until Moscow really, threw resources at the problem to support Lukashenko. It seemed that there was, one, an incredibly strong civic society, but two, what I found remarkable was not the violence of the regime, because clearly that's the hallmark of the sort of tactics that Moscow imposes, the KGB, FSB, Titushki, and all those other things, and also the Berkut, the dreaded Berkut in Ukraine. So that's not remarkable. What was remarkable was the peaceful nature of the Belarusian people that we could see. An extraordinarily civilized, very expressive, clearly very innovative people. But faced with I would say, extreme brutality, and that contrast between the regime and the people seems especially sort of great in this case. Why did the revolution fail? And what are the key differences between Maidan and its success, and obviously what happened in Belarus?
I I wouldn't claim an expertise, like to be an expert in Ukrainian politics in the first place. I would rather say what was impossible or what went wrong in Belarus. Um, the Belarus is a totalitarian or becoming a totalitarian society, and even in the most sort of like the most visible activists back in even like in the 90s or 2000s, some of them were targeted before they even walked up out of their own apartments, or even before they even make their mind like, am I going to take part in the protest? Am I going to call people to go on the street? Regime sort of, they trained well how to clean up the protest from the street, from the squares. I was in Kiev during Maidan, like in the early days in November, and then in April to see like there was again like a striking 2014, I mean, and there was a striking contrast, like when you see the cost of human lives and the heroic fight of Ukrainians, sort of despite the odds. I would just, I think, dare to say, like, it was not nearly impossible, like in this totalitarian conditions in Belarus, to organize it and um, to fulfill it till the successful ending. And which brings me to another point, like, why did it fail in 2020? Because if it was only, I would say, like, if it was not for Russian support, it would have changed. There were cracks or signs of cracks inside the system. And we also know that like first, like some of former Berkut guys, then they were invited to get the similar jobs in Belarus. And then what we know in 2020 is that Rosgvardia, like Russians, were some of those like Russian, not law enforcement or parliamentary group, whatever you call them, they were present in Belarus dispersing the crowds. It was not sort of clear in the broad daylight, but those Belarusians who went through repressions, they would say like, oh, could hear some odd accent. It's not a Belarusian accent. And then you would also see that the brutality of like detention, conducted by those like Russian folks was higher, because that's in a way like it's easier to target someone who's not your own, not from your own country. And when I talk about brutality, I mean there were literally blood, like almost like a pond of blood on the floor in the detention center. And that was I would say like that was the orders from Lukashenko, or like from higher up, to do whatever it takes to clean up the crowd. It means like he was so afraid because he saw that the opposition to his rule is like quite noticeable. I would also point out the support or lack of support or willingness to engage on behalf of the West. And when I was consulting some democratic groups, I would we would get this signal sort of from the Western counterparts that please try to keep the protest peaceful, because we don't want to trigger Russia over Belarus. We don't want second Maidan, or like the Ukraine type of scenario in Belarus. We don't want more instability in our NATO eastern flank. And of course, like Russia is a nuclear power, so let's not trigger it over such minor issues such as Belarus. So that in a part explains why it was peaceful. The protest was peaceful, and the protest leaders or the coordinators like of those like local protests were trying to keep it on the peaceful side. Also being afraid that if there is like violence or someone decides to be more violent, it could withdraw the Western support, which we need sort of direly. Because who else is out there? Like, who are our allies at that time?
Well, that's extraordinary, isn't it? Because, in looking at the history of Maidan, it is the fact that there were groups within the opposition who were prepared to resist the violence of the regime, to push back, to protect other protesters, irrespective of their political background. It's that essentially saved it. And those same forces who are able to rebuild the Ukrainian army back from having it hollowed out to nothing in the Lukashenko years. It's those very people which I'm sure these Western policymakers you speak of would not lend their support to, and it would persuade them to lie down and be beaten quietly, as long as it maintains some kind of fictitious stability. This seems to be the case here as well, and it seems to cut through policy in Ukraine as well, which is every move, every bit of support to Ukraine is measured against whether it will somehow trigger Moscow. It's a form of appeasement, and not to put labels on it, but what you're describing there sounds like a form of political appeasement as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I also wonder, like, if in the minds of like European or American policymakers, like, let's not trigger Russia over Belarus. It's like, hey, no, we have the tactical like nukes placed by Russians in Belarus. We're serving as a staging ground for the attacks in Ukraine. How far else this could go? And this was happening after a very peaceful protest, which allowed, by the way, like if it was not like Putin used the instability in Belarus or the Lukashenko crisis to expand his influence in Belarus. So like how far this would go.
That's it. Russia certainly seemed to consolidate its control, and any noises that Lukashenko may have made in opposition to Moscow policies, or how he demonstrably tried to show he was independent and not a puppet, that seems to, I mean, does anyone believe that anymore? Or does everyone see him as essentially a puppet of the Kremlin?
Well, I definitely see him that way. And when I look at your interview with Paul Hansberry, like it just feels like sort of good to know that there are certain colleagues like who still share this opinion. Like the problem or the matter here is when you don't have much insider information, the decision making in Belarus is a black box. especially again, like when none of the independent analysts have access to Belarus. Like we can rely on some maybe inside, like occasional insider conversations, trying to understand whom Lukashenko trusts, or what's the competition for power, how his decisions being influenced by Moscow. Um, but my take is that he is I don't think he could make major decisions in terms of foreign policy um, without getting approval from Moscow. Let's put it that way. Because what is keeping Russia from taking over or replacing Lukashenko, really? Like, who's going to step up or who's going to protect him? Not like no one. Um, and Lukashenko is good at, like, he has the power to control the population, like 9 million of people, maybe less now because of hundreds of thousands live in the country. So he has the resources to control it, to orchestrate the new elections coming up next year. But in terms of foreign policy, I don't think he has the discretion really to decide.
Well, Katsiaryna, it's been a huge pleasure speaking to you. You've prompted so many additional questions, which hopefully we'll save over for a future discussion. Hopefully, this people gives the audience an insight into what it's like being inside a state that is essentially, all vestiges of democracy and freedom of expression are whittled away and suppressed. I wish you good luck in all of your work, but thanks so much for coming on the channel today.
Thank you.